All right. So this actually was not the video that I was going to make today, but I got the idea and I was like, let me throw on my hoodie and let's do this. I want to preface it by saying that this is going to be talking about religious and spiritual topics. If that is not for you, do not feel like you need to watch this. Usually I approach abuse from very academic and objective perspectives, but for this specific topic, we really got to go into the spiritual of it all. So, uh, victims of abuse, we've all noticed how the abuser and enablers to the abuser, they're like obsessed with getting victims to forgive the abuser. Well, the first obsession is basically acting like no abuse occurred. If something happened, it's your fault or it didn't happen, you're getting gaslit. But if they cannot possibly force everybody to establish that no abuse occurred, they move to pushing for forgiveness. And it doesn't, why? Why are we obsessed with this? What is the deal? So part of it is that they don't want the abuser to have to take accountability. They don't want the abuser to experience any consequences. Again, because a lot of abuse is a status thing. So it's a person who is in a higher status position who's allowed to enact violence on a person in a lower status position. And so they are trying to reinforce that status hierarchy. And so the victim leveraging the rules against the person above them in status is something that is intolerable to this group of people. But I think there's another explanation as well. And I don't even necessarily think that people are consciously enacting this belief or this script. It may be subconscious. It may be just a script that they've learned like from society. But some people are doing it intentionally. So as the Epstein files have come more into light, a lot of the ideas of these like groups behind the scenes have been coming to light. And one of those ideas is that if they warn you first, if you get permission, that they are not responsible for any spiritual blowback. So that, if you agreed to it, like kind of like a BDSM contract, if you agreed to it, they can't be held responsible for like the terrible things that they do. And they can't experience, spiritual impacts from it. So in some traditions, it would be called karma. In Christianity, it'd be like, God's vengeance or God's judgment, really. And another piece of that is that if you can get the person that you've harmed to forgive you, those consequences are no longer your consequences because the victim, the person who owes the debt, has forgiven you. Now, one of the things that I do love about spiritual traditions is that they acknowledge that if you harm another person, there is a spiritual debt that occurs. And that you will receive spiritual consequences if you do not make it right, or if you do not get forgiveness from that person. And I want to say, so I'm old enough. I've been an atheist. Now I'm Christian, but I grew up in a New Age metaphysical church. And it was like New Thought. So they were very much like, you are creating the experience of your life. Evil doesn't exist. What's another one? We're all one. We've made contracts with each other before we incarnate, and therefore bad things that happen aren't actually bad. There is no good and bad. They didn't believe in dichotomy. They were like a weird amalgamation of, like Buddhism and Near Eastern religions, and just pretty much pulling from everywhere. But growing up in that, especially being abused, hearing that I'm responsible for what's happening to me, but also that like it's not bad anyway, and that I agreed to it ahead of time, A lot of victims of abuse, at least in the United States, have grown up in Christianity. So they are very well aware of how Christianity gets weaponized against victims of abuse. But I grew up in this different tradition. So there's a reason why I say abusers will literally use anything, any structure, anything that you agree to, they will figure out a way to weaponize it, because that's how they operate. So this is not just in Christianity. It's in Buddhism, it's in New Age, it's in atheists, it's in everybody. Abusers exist everywhere, and they use every framework to power over the victim. So anyway, I did reach a point where I realized, there's like a spiritual debt that somebody owes me. Now, in Christianity, I've done another video on this. In Christianity, we're told to forgive somebody who comes seeking forgiveness, which Christians misapply into you should never hold anybody accountable. Even if they don't come seeking forgiveness, you should forgive them. And I use forgiveness in sarcastic quotes because that's not forgiveness. That's a write-off of the debt that they owe you. And in Christianity, you give that debt to Papa Yahweh so that yours is clean. There's still like a spiritual debt law transaction thing happening, but in the Christian tradition, that spiritual debt exists. In Buddhism, and also Hinduism, you have that concept of karma. And so you can be a person that's experiencing tragedy, and people will look at you like, well, what did you do? This clearly must be something like a result of something that you did in a previous life. You must have been a very bad person. And so everybody, or not everyone will say this, and not everyone believes this, but people with bad intentions, bad faith actors in your family, in your community, they may say those things to you. So they'll use all of them. They'll use all of them. So anyway, if we just as a hypothetical thought experiment, take the idea of a spiritual debt as existing as a result of misusing, mistreating, powering over another person, harming them, even murdering them, like that you now have incurred a spiritual debt that you now owe in some way. Well, then the forgiveness pushers start to make a really horrible kind of sense. Because if they can get the victim to forgive the abuser, then the abuser can be free of that debt. But like when we're freeing people and they haven't done anything that makes them safe to free them from this debt, then from a spiritual realm perspective, they're not experiencing any consequences that they should be experiencing. The idea being that the spiritual realm has laws the same way that the physical realm has laws, like, the law of gravity, so that if you, or Newton's laws of physics and like thermodynamics, an object in motion will stay in motion unless an outside force acts on it, like stuff like that. So the idea being that, in the spiritual realm, there are also like these kinds of laws. Now, when I was an atheist, I was like, I'm being very logical and I'm only looking at things from a logical perspective. And so the idea of reparations did not make sense to me. And so what I'm specifically talking about is in the United States, there's a discussion about reparations to the children of children of slaves, that we recognize as a country that we have materially harmed this group of people and that we owe a debt and we want to make it right. So from a secular atheist, like logic perspective, I was like, this doesn't make sense. The people who did the harm are not the people who still exist anymore. So why would you go and try and force like a totally random other group of people to pay that back? Well, if you are in a spiritual tradition of some kind, be it Christianity or something or whatever, then you realize that the debt exists and that if you don't pay that debt, or if that debt is not forgiven, then you're going to experience the consequences of those actions, even if it's decades or hundreds of years removed from the original harm. That it is a mark on the country. And just like that, in an abuse dynamic, it's a mark on the abuser that they are carrying around. And so I first of all, I was like, oh, my bad on reparations. But we 100%. That's, if we were smart, we would do that. But sometimes we're not smart. And so France is going to have a reckoning too because of what happened with Haiti. But that's not going to get into that. So when abusers and enablers of abuse want you to give the abuser forgiveness, and the abuser hasn't even asked for that forgiveness, they don't act like they need to be forgiven for anything, but they're basically pushing it on you like it's a moral imperative that if you don't forgive them, that you're a bad person. Imagine all of this behind the scenes, that they know that there's a spiritual debt, maybe not subconsciously, but maybe subconsciously. They know there's a spiritual debt that the abuser owes, and that if they can't get the abuser to make it right, then you have to forgive the abuser in order for that debt to not exist anymore. And, so again, back to those background thingies I was talking about with the Epstein files, those groups where they try to trick you into giving permission because they think that if you give them permission that they can't be held responsible, or they warn you first and that if they warned you first they can't be held responsible. And this third one is that if you forgive them, then they don't have to experience the spiritual blowback of their own actions. In witchcraft or the occult, it's often like the rule of three. Anything that you put out will be returned to you thrice. So the idea being that if you're engaging in black magic, it will kick back on you 3 times worse than you put it out. Or if that you engage in white magic, that it'll come back to you 3 times as good. Now, I don't, just like a little side note, I'm a Christian, so I don't fuck with that anymore. And the reason why I don't do that anymore is because I realized, for me, not prescribing it to anybody, but one, that I don't know enough. I don't know enough to know what's good. There are many times that I thought that I know that if I do XYZ thing, that this is the right thing to do. And it turned out it added to the harm. So I was like, clearly I can't effectively make that calculation. And also I realized that a lot of it does impinge on people's free will and subverts like the laws of how things are working. And I was like, oh, okay. All right. I don't want to do that. And in fact, I personally ended up praying a prayer over my entire family line, me, my children and descendants, and also my antecedents. So like my grandparents and my great grandparents, blah, 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 all throughout our entire line, our entire history. I pray that we never are involved in slavery, enslaving people, and that we are never enacting or benefiting from the harm of other human beings. And I prayed that, like for me, in Jesus's name, amen, because I do not want my family line involved in any of that. Now, could we be less prosperous as a result of that? Yeah, but that's, you know what? That's blood money. That concept of blood money, that's not just an allegory or a metaphor. There are people that when they say blood money, they mean that money has like blood on it, spiritual blood in a spiritual sense, that even interacting with it is bad. And just in cases, I was like, not us, fam. sorry to my ancestors, but no, we're not trying to be involved in that. So anyway, when you're sitting there and you're just so confused, like, why are they obsessed with this? That's my theory. That's what I think is going on. And also, like, from a Christian perspective, there's that thing of, sinning allows entities to access you and do things. So again, not telling you what to believe, but that idea of, the entities might know that, even if the person doesn't. So anyway, it definitely changed. It changed how I looked at a lot of things, not just interpersonally, but also politically and from a socio-political perspective. Anyway, sorry for the weirdness. Hopefully this makes sense. And again, not trying to tell anybody what to believe, just sort of giving a context for why I think they're obsessed with getting victims to forgive the abuser. Anyway, hope this makes sense. And I'll talk to you next time.